Okay, so welcome back to Brian for Liberty. We are going to be talking about taxation today as a general principle. We're going to be talking about whether taxation is theft, is it an outright stealing of your personal property, or is it um, due to consensus something that is, and due to representation, something that we can justify, not as theft. So, and then if it is theft, is it justifiable despite the fact that it is theft? I would use the analogy of the poor person stealing bread to feed his family. It is theft, but is it justifiable? So we're going to have those conversations um, and see if you agree with where I end up. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the coronavirus stimulus bill. I hit on this a little bit in the last episode, and I wanted to revisit it just because I think a lot of people understand that the government had to do something. We needed to move forward. We needed to make something happen. There's a lot of very unusual steps being taken to try and slow this thing down, and it's impacting businesses very directly, and government specifically, and government orders are specifically hindering these businesses' ability to generate revenue. So there is a responsibility on the part of the government to make sure that these places stay liquid, because it is the government that is creating this scenario. Whether it's justified or not, they are creating the scenario. So something obviously has to be done to support these businesses. My opinion on the stimulus bill, a couple of things here is first, I think that we're way too early in this thing for a $2 trillion intervention into the marketplace. We don't know what directions this is going to take. We don't know where it's going to go. We don't know what the time frame of all this is going to be. So I think a smaller, more easily manageable, and something that would have had probably broader support in the general public, not just in government, but in the general public, would have been appropriate in the short term, while a more comprehensive bill was crafted in the event that this does become a long-term issue and to deal with some of the economic fallout from the actions that are being taken. So I think we were a little too early to pull the trigger on $2 trillion. There's nothing here to pay for it. There's no intervening spending reductions. Like I said, the last time we were together, is you're going to have falling tax revenue. We were already a $1 trillion deficit going into this fiscal year. So now we're adding $2 trillion of additional spending with no reduction in, um, or $2 trillion, yes, $2 trillion of additional spending with no mechanism to increase revenues to match that, and certainly facing falling payroll or falling taxes. So realistically, you're going to take that $1 trillion. Best case scenario, now you've got a $3 trillion deficit. Worst case scenario, which is the more realistic one, is you're going to have rapidly falling tax revenue that's going to increase that even more. So where are we going to 26, $27 trillion in federal debt by the end of this year, which is rapidly going to increase the amount of interest that we're paying on the debt. And it's definitely going to cause long-term structural issues in the economy, from the necessity to increase taxes, to reduce government spending, and to do other things to try and slow down this fiscal cliff that we're driving towards with all this debt that we're piling up. I think that we could have asked banks to suspend loan payments for business that are ordered to be closed. Um, we could ask banks to suspend loan payments for anybody who's newly unemployed. The Federal Reserve is pumping tons of money into the banking system, and they can support the banks through monetary policy and allow for people who have lost work to stop making those payments and go into a bit more of a survival mode where the unemployment insurance as it was would help them kind of bridge the gap between now and a more long-term solution. I think that we could expand unemployment to sole proprietors who wouldn't qualify for unemployment insurance would be able to file for unemployment if their business was closed due to the coronavirus, to help those people. And also, if we can suspend their small business loan payments to the banks, that coupled with unemployment, again, as a short-term measure to keep them afloat until, again, more long-term structural changes could be made. And then we could wait a month or two while working on better legislation to really see how this thing is going to shake out and what the economy is going to look like, so we can put a bill in place that makes sense once we have really a better idea of where this is going to go. If cases start peaking next week and we start seeing a decline in new cases and the economy can start opening back up, was a $2 trillion spending bill, was this necessary? So it's hard to say where we're going, and I think that's the point of not pulling the trigger on such a big piece of spending right out of the gate, and what is realistically kind of early in the process, in my opinion. So that's where we're at. The coronavirus right now, again, I don't talk about the virology or any of those aspects of it. I'm not an expert in those places. I do believe we should all be taking the standard measures. I'm going to say it every time. Stay home if you can, wash your hands, practice social distancing, be responsible. Try and think about the people who are vulnerable in your own family, and do everything you can to reduce risk. So let's talk about taxes. I think well, I know as a libertarian, one of the things you hear all the time is taxation is theft. If you're new to libertarianism, or if you visit a libertarian website, or talk to libertarians, but you don't know a lot about the party, taxation is theft is kind of a core inner monologue or dialogue that we have. Is yes, of course, taxation is theft. It's something that most of us pretty much hold as a fundamental truth. There are libertarians who don't, but I think the majority, at least the libertarians that I've come in contact with, do believe that taxation is a form of theft. So we have to look at how we get taxes to determine whether or not it is in fact theft. And there is no question that taxes are obtained through force and coercion, right? So you have to pay taxes. It's not optional. So you are being forced to pay taxes. And for many people would say that they're happy to pay their taxes, that that's the price you pay to live in a civilization, or civilized society. And I think that's fine. I think that's admirable. But I think the fact that you would be willing to participate in building a society of your own free will is a wonderful thing. I think it's the core of libertarianism, is not the idea that we shouldn't pay, and not the idea that we shouldn't be cooperative, that there are things that individuals cannot on their own provide for society as a whole, that there are many areas where we have to be cooperative. That's absolutely true. And I think it's admirable that there's a large number of people who pay taxes. When I have this conversation, say, well, I'm glad to pay my taxes, which of course, it's unfortunate you don't have that choice. Just because you were willing to pay doesn't eliminate the fact that you're still being forced to pay. Your willingness doesn't change the fact that if that were to change, it wouldn't matter. You would still be required to pay. The other thing is it steals away that sense of responsibility, that you are doing this of your own free will, and a little bit of pride that you can take in saying, I am willfully helping my community, my society be better by willfully participating in these things. It's the same feeling you would get from giving charitably, which we do on a very large scale in this country. That's being taken away from you through forced taxation. So it steals away a little bit of your personal dignity to be forced to participate. I always link it back to if my mom would tell me to do a chore that I was planning on doing. So I'm just getting ready to walk into the kitchen and start doing those dishes so mom can be proud of me without telling me to do it. Then she tells you to do it. Well, you lose that sense of, oh man, I was going to do it on my own and she was going to be all happy. Now I got told to do it. So I'll still do it, but now I'm not as happy about it. I'm not happy about it at all. So is it theft? Well, I think if you take a person's personal property against their will through force, and personal property does include money, then yeah, of course it's force, or of course it's theft. You can look at government as a form of consensus, but consensus doesn't change reality. Just because you have a large group of people who say, I should have access to your property, your money, doesn't mean the fact that they're taking it by force makes it any less theft. Taxation is still theft, despite a consensus. The other thing is that you're paying taxes, but you're getting representation. I think we can look at a lot of ways in which representation is false. The majority of the tax money you pay is going to the federal government in terms of income taxes, the fuel tax. There's a lot of taxes that you're paying to on the federal side that vastly exceed what they collect versus what you're paying to your state. And you can look at congressional approval ratings. You can look at the Princeton study that states that whether you have a 100% agreement on a law or zero support for a law, it has the same chance of passing. I think that when you look at your voice compared to the voices of everyone else who's voting, you have a very minuscule voice when it comes to what's happening at the federal level. So certainly at the federal level, it's very hard to say, yes, I'm being represented by my government. My voice is being heard by my government. I think that we know that the federal government, like I said, the approval ratings are incredibly low, particularly for Congress. And I think that no matter what party is passing laws, there's not a consensus. The division of the country would show you that if one party has control of the House and the Senate and the White House, and they're passing laws, 50% of the country is probably going to be angry about that particular law. So no matter what party is in power, there's a big group of people who feel that they're not being represented by their government. So, um, and then is it justified theft? I think is the last question. Okay, so taxation is theft. They're taking it by force. It's your property. Is it justified? That's where the argument always comes into how would we educate our kids? How would we take care of the poor? How would we provide medical care for people who can't afford it? How would we take care of our elderly? All those different things that the only way that those things are being handled today is because the government is forcing us to do it. The facts don't justify that. The facts don't back that up. The bottom line is when you look at how the government is spending your money, and we're going to get into that a little bit, they're not spending your tax dollars, particularly your income tax dollars, are not going to build roads and schools and take care of sick people. That's not what it's going for. The income tax historically has been a war tax. We've we've constantly gone to the income tax bucket in times of warfare to pay for war and to pay off debts from war. And that's kind of the historical. You look at every time the federal government has instituted some form of income tax, that's what the justification for, and it's always been a temporary measure to pay for that expense. In 1895, the Supreme Court shot down another attempt at an income tax that really looks like our current tax system. It was the first attempt at an unapportioned, progressive style of income tax, and it was deemed unconstitutional. And in 1916, we actually had to amend the Constitution of the United States to allow for our current system of income tax to even be deemed legal. And again, we went to the income tax well to pay for World War I. But because we amended the Constitution, it became permanent. We established the Federal Reserve, we established an income tax, and ever since then, the federal government has used the future earnings promised through the ability to tax income to borrow money, which is really how we ended up in the situation we're in now with $23 trillion in debt. They're literally borrowing from our future, from our kids' future, on a tax that was deemed unconstitutional and was only put in place at the time to pay for war debts. So when we talk about taxation, one of the things we have to remember about the income tax is that this was not a tax that existed historically until after World War I. It was never a permanent tax on the U.S. citizens. And again, it's not really a tax that's being used to do a lot of the things that we say, this is why we need a tax. The income tax isn't what's paying for those things. And the income tax, the personal income tax, is the largest form of federal revenue. So the majority of your taxes are collected through an income tax. And we're going to set aside the payroll taxes. We're going to get into those a little bit. But the majority of federal revenue that goes into the discretionary fund would be income tax. And then corporate taxes are down the line a little bit from there. And then there's some other federal taxes that kick in. But the majority of the federal income is from your taxes, from the taxation of your productivity. So when you look at the tax revenue, it's almost, your income tax revenue is almost completely consumed by military spending, and particularly when you include Veterans Affairs and the Department of Homeland Security, we roll that into defense spending or military spending. You're looking at really over $1 trillion of expenditures going right to military, and that in and of itself is close to 50% of the income tax that's collected. The next largest thing that income tax is going to pay for is the interest on the debt. And the interest on the debt this year was expected to be about $500 billion. I mean, you take $1 trillion in military spending, you take another $500 billion in interest on the debt, and you go, okay, there's $1.5 trillion. What's left? What's left is essentially about the same amount of money that's donated to charity privately. That's what's left over. And that pays for a lot of things, not necessarily health and human services related items. Supplemental, the SNAP program, supplemental nutritional program, is a tiny, tiny portion. Health and human services, very, very tiny portion of the discretionary federal budget. The things the federal government chooses to spend its money on, its priorities, very, very minimal when it comes to public need. And even if you look at the Department of Education, at the federal level, obviously we didn't have a federal Department of Education until 1979. It's not like that money's building schools. That money's not educating your kids. That money is No Child Left Behind, right? That is uh, curriculum guidance and mandates coming from the federal government telling your states how to run their educational system. That's not helping to pay really for education. You're paying for that through your property taxes. So when you look at the income tax, which is the largest tax, and you compare what the amount of money they're taking versus what they're spending on what we think the government should be doing, it's very minimal. So from that perspective, I look at the income tax and I say, this isn't being used for its stated purpose. I feel like we're being defrauded. When I hear people defend taxation, the largest tax is the income tax, and it's not being used for the purposes that people defend taxation are saying that's being used for. Now, the other side of this is the mandatory spending, which does include the interest on the national debt, but that isn't paid. That's paid still through income tax. The Social Security and Medicaid, first thing you'll hear is that those things pay for themselves. That's that's not true on a lot of levels. First, we know that the federal government has rated the Social Security Trust Fund. This is well documented, and that's outright though. There's no other way to deem that as theft. If the federal government takes $1 out of the Social Security program and uses it to cover another expense somewhere else, that's stealing. They're stealing your retirement. I look at the underfunding of Social Security, the kind of like, imagine your financial advisor was taking money out of your investment account so he could buy a boat, and then you caught him. Instead of punishing him for stealing your money, we said, well, now we're going to have to invest more with this guy so we can recoup the money that he stole. That's essentially what's going on with the Social Security program. The trust fund's been raided. Federal government spent that money in other places. They stole from one spot, and now they're saying, well, you have to invest more with us now because we screwed up and we spent your money in other places. So we can't trust government not to raid those funds. That money's being stolen. Second is that's money that's being invested into my future. I can do that on my own. I don't need government to do that. Government isn't spending that money, right? We're spending that money. They're taking it from us, and they're taking it from the companies that we work for, which means it's a payroll tax, which means that they're taking it from my income. Either they are taking it from my income as I'm earning less wages because every dollar the government pays me costs them more because they have to pay tax on every dollar that they pay me, or I'm paying more in um, the cost of goods. You remember that corporations don't pay for things, consumers pay for all the things, right? So if a company is showing a profit at the end of the year, that means you've covered their corporate tax, you've covered their payroll taxes, they don't pay their electric bill, they don't pay their gas bill. None of those things are paid for by corporations. You're paying for that in the price of the goods and services you're purchasing from them, which is why the corporate tax makes no sense at all. It's just a shadow tax on the general public. It's essentially a sales tax is really what it is, because that's just a pass-through expense for corporations. They're not paying that, you're paying it. So when you talk about we need to raise corporate taxes and corporations need to pay more tax, you're essentially just saying I want to pay more for all the things that I buy, or I want to earn less from the company that I work for because that expense is going to be absorbed by the public somewhere. Um, so when we look at taxation and how it's being used, it's certainly not serving its stated purpose. The government can't be trusted to handle it properly. Money is being stolen from what is supposed to be protected funds to cover other expenses. We're borrowing from our future, and the overwhelming majority of our productivity that's being taxed is being used to fund a massively oversized military and conducting operations all over the globe, and is essentially sending massive interest payments to the banking system. It's a transfer of wealth from the working class to big corporations that get these government contracts through the military, and the banks that are creating money out of thin air and lending it to the government at interest are, though, that's where the wealth is. You want to talk about the wealth transfer, that's the wealth transfer right there. So the income tax is the income tax in general, I think, is It's theft. I believe that 100%. I think all forms of taxation are theft. The question now we're asking is it justified? I think we've beaten up the income tax. We've talked about why Social Security and Medicaid aren't great. Um, the other side of this all is the humanitarian side. And so if we're not paying Social Security and Medicaid and we're not paying a property tax to build schools and we're not doing these things, how will society function? That question terrifies me, to be honest with you. It terrifies me that we as a race, as the human race, can't look at ourselves and say, yeah, I don't have to be forced at gunpoint to participate in society. Or that the only way society can possibly function is if we force everybody to participate at the end of a gun. That's terrifying to me. That first, it really takes the quality of humanity, what we think of ourselves and of our fellow man, and we obviously have a very little opinion of ourselves, our fellow man, that we have to be forced to do the right thing in order to participate. The fact that if government disappeared tomorrow, if every government agency disappeared tomorrow and we weren't paying taxes, would we not figure out a way to build roads? Would we not figure out a way to educate our children? Would we not figure out a way to care for our elderly? Of course, I can't help but say, yeah, of course we could. Of course we would try and we would figure these things out. Of course we would cooperate. Of course we would work together to solve these problems. And, and I would say furthermore that if we were voluntarily contributing to these programs, they would be much better ran. You could take an example of private charity versus government humanitarian services, and you could say even the small amount of money that the government allows to trickle through back to health and human services, the money is essentially 30 cents on the dollar actually makes it to the people it's intended to help. Whereas on the private charity side, on average, of course, some are better and some are worse, but on the private charity side, the average is 70 cents on the dollar actually makes it back to the people it's intended to help. Because you are voluntarily giving that money, there's a very high level of accountability. I would love to see that level of accountability in our public schools, in our elder care, in all of our health and human services industries across. I would love to see the level of volunteerism and the level of care that comes with that, and the level of public scrutiny that comes with that, as opposed to a forced system where there is no accountability. I mean, you got the accountability of elections, but we've seen that we're not getting the results we need through voting. So these systems aren't getting better, these programs aren't getting better. But in a voluntary system where they had to earn the money, where you had the choice to give or to not give, those systems would function with a much higher level of efficiency. They would have to. So that's from roads to healthcare to infrastructure to schooling. If taxation wasn't forced upon us and we were voluntarily cooperating, the efficiency levels of these things would be much higher. They would also be much more local, where you would have a much more powerful voice. I don't want Madison shouldn't be making decisions for schools in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Washington, D.C. shouldn't be making decisions for schools in Wyoming. Locality, let local communities solve these problems, and we can cooperate on larger levels through, you know, well, just through basic cooperation. We're doing it now. Yeah, keep in mind that government is just a form of cooperation, but they are also a monopoly on force. You could leave a lot of these same institutions, the planning commissions and things of that nature in place, but these people would have to volunteer their time, and the money that they would be requesting would have to be well accounted for, because they would be asking, hey, we need to fix this road from here to here. Here are all the bids. Here's how this is going to work. And this is the money we need to raise in order to make this project happen. And through that form, that kind of a system, I think you would have much, much better efficiencies when it comes to the things that we're looking at government to do for us. So when I look at tax, I look at it's clearly force. We are not properly represented. The money's not being used for its stated purposes, and therefore it's clearly theft. Is it justifiable? It's only justifiable if you believe kind of the worst things about society. And quite frankly, if that's what you believe, then government should be even more terrifying, not less so. Government is ran by people who seek power primarily. That's not necessarily the best amongst us, right? I don't think anybody would say politicians are the best amongst us. Presidency is a popularity contest, as are most elections. These people spend 70% of their time fundraising, not working for the people. And they spend that time fundraising because they want to stay in power and they want to maintain their power. These people go to Washington, D.C., and then they become wealthy. So if you believe that society can't be trusted on its own, then it's even more important that central authority doesn't control society because that's just another part of society. So, is it justified? I would say it's clearly not. Non-representation, not doing its stated purpose. So, and it's, in my opinion, I don't think it's necessary. We're so afraid of the free market that it's been so vilified in its perceived failings primarily in healthcare. That's kind of the latest discussion, but every one of its failings can be traced back to government intervention. Go back and listen to my episode on Medicare for all and look at what government did to our healthcare system and how we ended up where we are. When you look at major failings in the private market, you're going to see massive amounts of government intervention. And when you look at the greatest successes in the private market, you're going to see that largely among the or less regulated industries. Technology is a less regulated industry by a wide margin than healthcare, and it is proven to be highly accessible across income. It has improved marketably in very short periods of time. It's highly accessible. It's like I said, it's improved vastly in short periods of time, and from a cost perspective, it has maintained a very reasonable cost structure across the board. So I look at less regulated industries and I say they're doing a much better job than industries that are heavily interfered with on the governmental side. So again, I look at the fact that government providing these services and government being involved in these industries is a hindrance to society, not a help for society. We can't look at government as what is creating a society. It is really holding society back from reaching its greatest potential. So that's where, when we talk about taxation and when you hear people say taxation is theft, you really have to dig into that and try and understand in what ways government is serving us well and in what ways government is failing us. And I think that when you look at it, you'll see very clearly that government's primary purpose is to really it's warfare, it's transferring wealth to the banking system, and it is creating fear and division amongst the people so that we don't trust each other enough to start walking away from these old and ineffective institutions that have been built up around us. So next week we're going to be talking about some new things. We're going to get a little controversial, probably, and talk about race in this country and racism. What kind of power does it have in society? We're going to touch on systemic racism. And is racism holding back minorities in this country, or is the idea of racism doing much more harm than the actual racism? So that'll be next week's episode. I look forward to it. I'm going to try and get a few more episodes out during the week, shorter episodes, kind of 5 minute, 5 to 10 minute quick topics, hit the news a little bit. So I'm going to try and increase the amount of content that I'm putting out. But I just wanted to get this one out. This is my fourth episode. I don't even know. Um, and hopefully I'll just keep getting better at this as we go. And as I keep going, then hopefully we grow a little bit more of an audience. And thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.